fifth edition of International Political Sociology Winter School. So the Winter School started last Monday on the 1st with a select group of very engaged participants, of which some of you are part of. And as part of our activities, this afternoon, we bring together our amazing faculty of this first week to this public event to share their insights on the theme, broadly defined as the challenge of critique in conservative times, thinking transversally with international political sociology. So from your left to the right, we have Grayson, who is a professor in security, politics, and culture in the School of Geography, Politics, and Sociology at Newcastle University. Ritu Vij, a senior lecturer in the School of Social Science at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. We have Jef Huysmans, professor of international politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London, and João Nogueira, adjunct professor or assistant professor, depending on how we translate that, at the Institute of International Relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. João is also the coordinator of the IPS Brazil Network and the IPS Winter School, one of the coordinators, without whose determination all of this editions wouldn't have been possible. So we have an hour and a half, so I ask each one of you to keep the interventions to 12 or 15 minutes at most, to leave us enough time for Q&A and the interventions of the audience afterwards. So before I pass the microphone, let me just briefly share with you all what they have been invited to reflect upon. So are we living through a return of great power politics and geopolitical imaginations of difference and relations? What is left of critique when geopolitical thought thrives on the critique of globalization and neoliberalism? And maybe more importantly, what intellectual resources does international political sociology offer to transmute the eternal pendulum between the internationalism of realpolitik and the liberal globalism of transnational flows and interdependencies? The roundtable explores if and how thinking transversally offers pathways for creatively interfering in conservative understandings of power politics and the rise of, at times, socially and politically equally conservative impulses to transcend the world of states into a new planetary totality. Thinking transversally also raises questions about the value and limits of critique and the politics of counterpositioning to craft new possibilities. If contemporary international politics is indeed rife with repressing, dissenting, and disrupting lines of thought and practice by repetitively evoking that there is no alternative, given that the world is under serious threat of pandemics, nuclear catastrophes, ecological collapse, and so on, can international political sociology offer analytics not of hope, but of lines of flight that take life as always in the making? So with all that, I'm gonna ask Kyle to share with us some of his thoughts on that.
Many thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here on this roundtable with such esteemed colleagues. So on this basis, I can't help but feel I'm going to disappoint with my answer, but we'll give it a go. So the prompt for this evening's been a difficult one, and I think I'm going to be focusing sort of more on the limits of critique and what critique means in conservative times. So it's a prompt that itself raises a series of questions. So the obvious ones: what do we mean by critique? What do we mean by conservatism? What do we mean by transversality? And what do we mean by international political sociology? Then what challenge does critique emerging from international political sociology pose to conservatism? Or what challenge should it pose? And in what ways can transversality and international political sociology both engage in critique and engage in critique that challenges conservative times? But I think all of these potentially contribute to a longer and a much larger standing question, an international, in brackets, political sociology that arises from its emergence. And that's the what is to be done question. Or how do we work through the what is to be done question? Or to put it differently, how are our scholarly and political practices connected in the pursuit of critique? Or even less grandiosely, what are the politics of transversality and how is this best enacted? I can't possibly answer all these questions in 12 minutes. So with the time that I have, what I'm going to do is do my best to articulate some answers that first them in ways that I hope are productive to the theme at hand and maybe a bit controversial, because the last time we did one of these, it was about the war in Ukraine. I think, João, you got very upset that we were all so measured in what we were saying, and you wanted something a bit more lively. So, to start, no approach has a monopoly on critique if we're thinking of possessing the means to offer criticism. Where I think potentialities become far more differentiated is in the critical capacity of critique. So I'm going to start with an operational conceptualization of critical as a heuristic for working through what I'm speaking about. Contingency, historicity, relationality, and the one that I think sometimes gets jettisoned to the side, a concern with transformation. But transformation can mean many things. But particularly transformation that addresses, it could be social injustice, it could be inequality. It's about trying to make the world better. So, of course, what does that mean? But a change of magnitude, such as the underlying structures and practices that shape a specific socio-political order, are altered. Status quo no longer holds. But I want to urge some caution. And that's, there's no path dependency here in terms of the political challenge. Transformation can be regressive and reactionary too. And contemporary conservatisms, which are probably best understood as historically and geographically situated forms of fascism, aim for transformation of a particular kind, understand the social reproduction of the socio-political order in a particular way, and they also claim to be addressing particular forms of suffering. Perhaps not suffering that we would recognize, but certainly their adherents recognize. However, let's bracket that off for a moment, as perhaps there's a different concern to address in relation to the field. There is an abundance of work incorporating contingency, historicity, and relationality, but you kind of see less that is overtly engaging with issues of transformation. What transformation might look like, how we can do it, and what to watch out for. Or to put it more bluntly, so coming with the controversy now. One could argue that there may be a retreat into the apolitical. And I realize this is a big claim and it's controversial, but I'm going to try and work through it. So I'm going to start with a story. And because Victor's here, he can confirm that this indeed did happen. After our first year of editing the journal International Political Sociology, we decided to have an editorial meeting because we were desk rejecting a high number of papers coming into the journal on the basis of fit. And to be honest, it wasn't so much the volume of desk rejections that focused our attention, but rather a realization that if pressed, we needed to and weren't able to provide a pithy answer to what it was about fit and why things weren't fitting. So I think in the end, we landed very close to a quasi-definition proposed by Bassaran et al. In the introduction to their edited volume, International Political Sociology, Transversal Lines. I'm just going to quote that directly, that IPS questions the rationales through which international relations has defined the international, political science has understood politics, and sociology has conceptualized society. So we've got questions, definitions, understandings, conceptualizations, international, political, sociological. So critically questioning definitions, understandings, and conceptualizations that inform and shape our practices, and our practices inform and shape our conceptualizations, definitions, and understandings, and identifying the cuts that they make in order to order our worlds is an important and ongoing project of inquiry. And as a part of this, I think one of the most underappreciated and underpracticed modes of critique in conservative times is immanent critique. Immanent critique has a long tradition in sociology, weaving its way back to Marxian, Hegelian dialectics in Marx, and the identification of congenital contradictions within capitalism through to Adorno and the Frankfurt School and so on. And while it remains a contested concept and methodological approach, at its heart is a concern with undertaking criticism that's directly linked to trying to evaluate logics and practices internal to something, so whether it's theory, ideology, culture, society, together with an understanding that this requires assessing the rationality or value of those logics and practices on their own terms. So predominantly immanent critique is a means to expose the logical fallacies and a prioris that underpin understandings and practices on their own terms. And unfortunately, there are a series of practices, understandings, theories, and thinkers who have been reduced to signifiers of particular bads without, I think, the necessary levels of engagement to understand why the underlying logics are attractive and how they work, understand where the underlying logics implode on themselves and how they do so, and how these logics shift and churn in concert with events, alternative practices, chance encounters, their locations in time and space, and the modes through which there is contestation. So I think there's a danger that too often critique is grounded in a totalizing caricature, which risks misdiagnosing the stakes and misdiagnoses or misses the politics. The renewed attention to methodology and method has been extremely beneficial to expanding imaginations about the who, where, what, why, how, and when of research practices in international political sociology. But I fear in some cases, the methodological move is considered sufficient without thought of how it links to questions of transformation. And I think this is a fundamentally important argument that's presented by Jef and Claudia Eredau in their EJIR article. Methodologies and methods also co-constitute the worlds they study. So what kinds of worlds are being created? What's their transformative potential? And I fear this question isn't being asked often enough. And that secondly, there isn't enough reflection on the supporting argument that they make in that article, that depending on the sociopolitical context, a range of methods have the potential to initiate acts of critique that disrupt conventional understandings of our social world. I've really taken that to heart, and particularly trying to move away from some of the sectarianism that can define fields. Or to put it somewhat differently, here we're going to get controversial again. Post-positivism in and of itself, or particular methods associated with it, are not necessarily meaningful critical political projects with transformative potential. Which brings me to my third and final concern: how to overcome the tendency of complexity to produce political paralysis. So, post-humanism in the age of the Anthropocene has made important contributions to challenging the clean lines that have previously been established to separate the human and non-human, culture, nature, material, immaterial, subject, object, so on and so on and so on. But to be blunt, mapping and assemblage isn't an inherently political project, let alone a transformative one. Likewise, acknowledging uncertainty on its own isn't particularly transformative either. But I can understand why these are responses to the present moment, where all the pathways appear to lead to denialism, despair, or negativity that approaches nihilism. The former is an attempt to discover a means of control. The latter, too often, a retreat into technocracy in the face of the death of the expert. So to return to my question, so what is to be done? So I think immanent critique, not just on predominant discourses, methods, and forces, but on those within the field of international political sociology themselves. And for those of you who have been at the winter school, that's what João and Jef and Ritu have been doing with you guys in very kind of clever ways to get you to think through right? What are the limits? What are the issues with some of the things that we sometimes sort of take as being without them? I think we also need to extricate ourselves from the vortex of pure negativity. It's got a very strong gravitational pull. It's where we have a tendency to head up and look to the horizons of possibilities. And as Jef and João have argued before, it's about the possibilities that arise from the productive potential of forces at play. This might produce a more pragmatic and less ostentatious politics. But unlike year zero projects, it's less likely to end with a hippie playing a flute in a field or people lined up against the wall. So finally, under the old Foucauldian maxim that the question isn't if something's good or bad, but rather how it can become dangerous, I still think we need to remain cautious. Social fields can transform as lines of flight connect in productive ways. But as Deleuze and Guattari also warn, lines of flight can become regressive. They can reproduce strict segmentations that lead to lines of destruction. So I think within IPS, there continues to be a need, and more broadly, there continues to be to investigate the potentials of lines of flight that contribute to the intensification of life, as well as those that risk its diminishment and destruction. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
I'd just like to stand because the chair is so low. Is that all right, Francine?
You'll need a microphone.
Oh,
Because we're on YouTube.
they're bringing it. All right. Okay. Oh, sorry to complicate things. Just hold on to them. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks so much, not just for organizing this roundtable, for the generous invitation to be here at the Winter School and the warmth of the reception. I'm always blown away by the reception and the hospitality that we receive, and even more blown away by the quality of engagement I get in the classroom, always at PUC-Rio. So thanks very much for that. So I'll begin with a couple of epigraphs, more than one. What we have to accomplish in the present is a ruthless criticism of everything. Ruthless in two senses. The criticism must not be afraid of its own conclusions, nor of conflict with the powers that be. That's Karl Marx. Political theory comes also from the slum. That's Ashish Nandy. There's something in critique which is akin to virtue that you'll recognize, that's Foucault. But finally, also on critique, but this time from Alice in Wonderland. Alice, I just wanted to ask which way I ought to go. The Cheshire Cat. Well, that depends on where you want to get to. Alice, oh, it really doesn't matter as long as I, and the Cheshire Cat interrupts, then it really doesn't matter which way you go. So implicit in the prompt is the suggestion that transversal thinking in IPS meets to some degree the challenge of critique in conservative times. Conservative can refer to the state of the world or the nature of disciplinary time. On the former, one can be petulant and ask, what is distinctive about our times? Each era seems to fancy the fiction that it is unique, it is crisis-ridden, it is unprecedented. Historical amnesia clearly sets in here, perhaps. Have you forgotten the 1930s in Europe, or the savagery of the colonial adventure, or the never-ending assaults on tribals, Dalits, Adivasis, the Burakumin, or on the ever-increasing population in favelas across the global south? The proto-fascism in open display in Euro-America may be new, but the dispossession and the violence that accompanies it are, of course, not new phenomena. We have been here before. At its core, the current mood assumes a liberal horizon in its totality. Perhaps the distinctive element of our times is the exhaustion of the liberal project and its aftermath. especially following its triumphal assault on any alternative possibility. I take the prompt as an invitation to think about how we critique in a manner perhaps similar to what Kyle has done, the cultures and sites of critique, but not the broader question of the limits of critique. And actually, I think there are two parts to the prompt, and I don't necessarily know if they're interrelated. I'll speak principally on the first with some initial remarks on the second. To begin with, I'll speak to the habits of domesticated critique in the academy, and then turn to the question of transversality. And my remarks are directed principally to the students in the room. What is domesticated critique? I think we are habituated by training, by the politics of knowledge production, to enact modes of what are principally protocols and habits of what we can recognize and call as external critique. We take our respective theoretical investments and standards of judgment internal to our conceptual, theoretical, pedagogical landscapes, but external to the architecture of other horizons of thought as a ground from which we engage theoretical difference. And we do this largely unconsciously, treating external critique as a normalized practice of academic professionalization in IR, and one that we all tacitly share. Academic circulation depends on acceptance into specific epistemic communities forged around clearly demarcated theoretical and political camps. This sharp and all too quick delineation of one's positioning in the world of ideas normalizes external critique as a mode of intellectual exchange, and it's far easier to leverage than the mode of scholarly engagement that requires what the late geographer Doreen Massey once described as slow thinking. There is, though, a second reason why external critique dominates, and I, for one, I make an extra attempt to alert students to this, all right, not to fall into this trap. The binary mode of thinking appropriate and necessary to the politics of contestation in the so-called real world has seeped into our intellectual life ever since academics began to see their intellectual work not for what it is, the pursuit of nuanced and careful debate and self-clarification, but equivalent to politics itself. Binary modes of intellectual positionings mimic and echo political forms of engagement that we treat as objects of critique. In this, I think we engage in a kind of magical thinking that has entered academia, in which using the right words is made equivalent to the political task of forging a prefigurative politics of a world otherwise. And the moralism that usually saturates the high decibel landscape of politics comes then to pervade protocols of academic critique that work to further entrench habits of mind, which normalize practices of external critique. But critique in its immanentist mode, as Kyle has pointed out, though I take a slightly different view of what that constitutes, immanent critique approaches its object quite differently. Immanent critique does begin as a formal negativity and as dissensus, but then it attempts to enter its object, so to speak, boring from within. Working with the text, adopting its methodological presuppositions, substantive premises, and truth claims as its own, immanent critique tests the postulates of a text or society by its own standards of proof and accuracy. Critique is the practice of inhabiting something in a meaningful way, such that one learns where and how that thing breaks down, and then pursuing that breakdown as an object of thought and action. This is hard, laborious work, requiring slow thinking in an age of compressed academic production. But it is also political work, and that's what I want to add to what you said, Carl. In Marx's reformulation of Hegel, immanent critique is above all social critique that attempts to grasp the failure of social practices to live up to their own norms because of their determination by relations of social domination. Relations that in turn expose these contradictions. Immanent critique as a habit of mind for intellectual engagement can also, in other words, generate more effective means of political engagement. And I think that is the value of immanent critique. Are there different cultures of critique? If critique as a practice exists in a time and place, then in our present context, I think my answer would have to be no. Amitav Kumar, a novelist and an academic of Indian origin living and working in the American Academy, notes self-deprecatingly, I belong not to India or the US, but to the academy. I realize I'm a sad provincial. For years, I've been living in a place called the English department. And of course, what he's flagging is the disciplining protocols of engaging even in critique, that we live in this world of critique, which is highly, overly professionalized. He also goes on to add, I doubt the 3.2 million poor in Chiapas or the 500,000 beggars in Calcutta hunger to read debates between elites in New York City and New Delhi. This is, one might say, a really vulgar formulation, but it does make the broader and, to my mind, more crucial point about cultivating a practice of critique as a fundamental attunement to the world, rather than as a performance of academic theoretical mastery. I'm going to skip over a little bit on this. I have more to say on the sides of critique, but in the interest of time. Finally, I do want to make a point before I move on to transversality. If critical academic thought, which is what we're all engaged in, is to serve emancipatory struggles, we need, I think, to embrace what Gayatri Spivak has described as the productive unease of persistent critique. Maintaining a critical attitude, that's Foucault, not only towards the bad objects of disciplinary IR, Eurocentrism, for instance, but eventually toward modalities of critique that risk becoming the new holy cows of critical thought. And the new holy cows of critical thought, I think we can include abolitionist thinking, Afro-pessimism, decolonial thinking, indigenous thought, as the case may be. So this stance may lose us friends, but it may also be the only way to cultivate knowledge, to pursue a praxis of ruthless criticism, and not be afraid of the conclusions we reach. But a few questions remain, and I guess the more important ones for this panel. Does transversality offer a better avenue to further the aims of critique? Or does it reproduce some of the same aporias found in previous attempts? And here my sympathies, I think, are aligned with a lot of what Kyle said. And what kind of political possibilities does transversality generate as an analytic? Transversality as a notion opposes, and here I'm quoting, both verticality in the sense of hierarchies and horizontality, and it is non-categorical and non-judgmental, and it defies disciplinary categories and resists hierarchies. Following Deleuze and Guattari, transversality calls attention to shared deterritorialization as, and I quote, zones of proximity, non-localizable spaces of relation that bring the underground and overground, movement and home, outside and inside, into the proximity of one another. But how does transversality translate on the ground, as it were, into research practice? Okay. So here I've been a good student. I've done a lot of homework and looked for actually material that I can share with you. So I think three approaches dominate. The first echoes IPS's original self-positioning as an orientation to thought that ruptured what the philosopher Lewis Gordon has referred to as disciplinary decadence, restricting inquiry into a social object very narrowly to a single disciplinary perspective. So in its simplest translation, transversality can and was taken initially to be simply interdisciplinarity. But the second more interesting twist on this interdisciplinarity as the mode of doing transversality is the attempt to generate what Kojin Karatani and then Zizek took up the term, referred to as the parallax view, or what I think of as a montage effect. Both outline research trajectories that are multiple and indeterminate. One does not subsume the other, but each generate in juxtaposition a sense or a sensing that exceeds in any one trajectory when considered in isolation. So montage in cinematic texts can produce a sense of unease, since it does not provide a totalized narrative that gathers up the disparate elements once again, slicing, splicing, cutting to create yet another exclusionary episteme. Affectively, cinematic and literary montage fragment and rupture any claim to mastery, sovereign self-possession, and throw open a space to feel and perhaps think otherwise. Whether the juxtaposition of varying sensibilities and modes of sensing can augment understanding, and the far more difficult question of making this new form of sensing intelligible in and for the IR community is an open-ended question, and one that I think is really important for younger scholars starting out on the IPS journey. How do you translate your approach and the research that you do to the wider IR community, right? And not just speak to an IPS self-enclosed community. But a second approach to transversal research moves a step beyond the montage effect to engage in what Lauren Ballant and Kathleen Stewart called ethnographic grounding, a commitment to writing from the ground, an impulse to stay open to what is in one's vicinity. This ground, they've argued, should not be assumed as a context, but sensed as a becoming. It is a world of conjunctures, an aesthetic, and a threshold, and a jumping off scene for a line of associations, a space of potentials through which concepts, knowledge, and normative stances break through, break down, and solidify. Okay, so I have two examples of this kind of research. I'll skip over the first one, but I can share that if there is an interest in it. But in the interest of time, I'll just go to the last, and for me, the most powerful example of transversal research. So the best example I've encountered of a Deleuzian-inspired transversal ethnographic work is by an anthropologist that I was talking to Jimmy about earlier, Bhrigupati Singh. His book is called Poverty and the Quest for Life, Spiritual and Material Striving in Rural India. It was based on 18 months of ethnographic work in a little village in Rajasthan among people living in unthinkable poverty, whose quality of life measured by normative indicators like caloric intake and consumption expenditure could be deemed to be abject. But moving away from normative notions of good life and Agamben's notion of bare life, Singh turns to Deleuzian concepts of intensities, vitality, waxing, and waning, to reject dualisms and discrete quantities in favor of a view of singular but agonistic forces to identify lives lived at different thresholds of intensity. What is good at one threshold, food, may be harmful at another, such as water. Similarly, rather than using binaries of state failure, and the production of violence in spaces of care, Singh identifies two local gods by the name of Varuna and Mitra as deities of sunrise and sunset at different thresholds of sovereignty, the fractured sovereignty. And he develops an account that is acutely tuned not only to the ever-present sense of threat and crisis in the lives of the people he interacts with, but also the potencies, potential and actual life force, and people's desires as they shape the everyday. And adopting what Bill Connolly described as a nomadic mode of doing research, this is Bill Connolly commenting on Bhrigupati's work. He says that Bhrigupati inhabits the planetary condition in which the study is set and achieves what transversality as a way of doing research recommends: the ability to roam, return, and rethink. The ability to roam, return, and rethink. And I think Singh's unorthodox provocation is something to reflect on. Thank you.
Yes. Can you hear me in the back? Good. I'll try not to move so you can keep on hearing me. I'm going to change. I'm going to talk from a situation and a question that was asked me when I was visiting the University of Lapland in Finland 2 months ago. I was asked by people in security studies to say, we are in a conundrum because it's impossible to develop a critique of the joining of NATO. This is in the wake of the Ukrainian war. Finland very quickly left its neutral status, moved into NATO, and therefore nationally there was a massive reproduction and production of a geopolitical, geostrategic pool. And it became impossible, they said, to formulate critique of this. There was ostracization going on if you did critique. So I said, what does critical security studies have to say? And there were critical security studies people. So I thought, thank you. I'll have a think what I can do. I'm going to use that to reflect a little bit of how, I used or you could use IPS instruments. In this case, I'll talk a bit about security field, to deal with the conservatism, because they were clearly upset. I mean, there's lots of things going on. I was in the north of Finland at the Arctic Circle in a city called Rovaniemi, where the University of Lapland is, you know, and it has one of the biggest military exercise terrains for artillery exercises. It has one of the most northern, at least in Finland, airports where you can land and so on. So there was a lot going on about it. And nationally, NATO was consensus. So there was actually a building of consensus, what from any kind of critical engagement with security was a re-emerging and an institutionalization in a very forceful way of geopolitical, geostrategic thinking, which pulled everyone in, even if you wanted to move out. So what do we have to offer for this? The conservatism that emerges here is, on the one hand, a re-emergence of geopolitics. It's all about there's no position possible in between the states. So that was one element. But the other one is that there is no alternative. So that is that you could see that there is a that the geopolitical and geostrategic thing was not necessarily a contested element. It became toxic. It became toxic. It's toxic too, but it's not necessarily toxic. It means that it tries to actually set itself as the common sense. And what I got from why the question emerged is that it was very rapidly doing that. That doesn't mean there's no opposition, but generally it became very difficult to have opposition, almost impossible. So critique, so there is a conservatism that does a combination of what we could call thinking security back again geopolitically and geostrategically with the center of the state and all the geopolitical kind of moves, but also that you become toxic. There is no alternative. And it does establish that, so it establishes as a common sense within which. Now, one was still doing work about establishing this common sense. Now then critique, what is critique? Critique becomes the practice through which you try to turn the toxic into, to use Bourdieuan terminology, an orthodoxy. Now, what's an orthodoxy? A common sense emerges as an orthodoxy when you have heterodoxy kind of positions that are possible. So when you break open, that there is not just one, that is the common sense is no longer sense in the sense of we take it for granted. So you have actually an opening up. And so critique is really an engagement through which you can do analytically in this case about breaking the toxic, or the toxification, if you want to, of the situation. And so what I was sitting there, I said, what is this for a question? Because in some way it's very, security studies does all kinds of things. So one of the answers it would provide is that we move, you know, much of this rendering of the toxic is, well, you know, it's inevitable. Or one just a very classical thing, you know, you have all kinds of other problems, but it's existential. There's no, you know, it's the first one. If you don't, I mean, it's the classical argument. If you don't deal with this, if you don't join NATO, we'll get invaded possibly by Russia, and that's Finland is in deep trouble. So do you want that? You know, no. So you first go with that one. So there are things going on. So security studies will say, well, you know, there is a process going on in which we look how certain actors are constituting and instituting this particular point of view of understanding of security. But that doesn't really give you the other kind of options. So it just says the toxic thing is a process in and of itself. So it didn't actually, that it doesn't give people a position analytically or so to stand and say, no, there are alternatives available for how Finland, in this case, or we as social movements or whatever in Finland can position ourselves in relation to the problem. The other one is, of course, to go with alternative kinds of conceptions of security, which is, the critical security has done a lot. As you go and look, for example, at feminist movements, how they define security, or you have social movements who redefine security in other ways, and so on. But because of the toxic and some element of domination that emerged around what I could get, why they were in this conundrum, around the geopolitical kind of rendering and the realist one, this becomes a replaying of the realist idealist. So the other one, the social movement activist, becomes positioned as the idealist. And therefore, it's very difficult to get an inroad, because that's exactly what the ostracization of any critique made possible. They said, well, you know, yeah, we can deal with these problems later on. or they're irrelevant, and so on. So it doesn't mean that these are not critical moments and critical kind forms of thinking that you can do and you can look at them. But there seemed to be, gradually I started thinking maybe why the conundrum is there is, how do we enter the security professionals or the security element itself? Because something that remains in the securitization, the process, as well as in the alternative, is that the alternatives are positioned, if they're social movement, outside of what the geopolitical analysis will call the people who know about security, the security institutions. So you come from the outset, that's why you're idealist. You don't know what you're talking about in some way. So you got these moves. What all this analysis does do is, it seems to assume, or it doesn't give us an inroad in understanding, does this security community, this group of security people, do they actually share? Is the security, geopolitical security, shared and instituted? So the doxic element of security is shared within the security professionals, is the assumption, or there's no inroad into that one. And that's why I thought that IPS, which is stuff, in this case, about fields and security professionals, is an inroad to start engaging and breaking through this process of making this geopolitical security positioning, which actually legitimized the very fast move into membership of NATO and a bipolarized understanding in which the classical position of neutrality disappeared as an option as well. Is, look, what does one do? Let's look at what has happened partly in IPS. You can say it's also a form of critical security studies. What has happened is, let's go and look, where is geopolitical security thinking based? Who are the professionals who drive it? But to do that, you will see that normally any field of professionals and oneself have kinds of conflict, rivalries, and redefinitions. So you can enter in the heart of the security, what can we call it? Apparatus, if you want to, but let me call field, because that's the term that's being used. And what you will see, most, I've done the empirical work, but I was just saying, what kind of analysis do we know to get? You can engage with them, their own language, their own approaches, because there will be differences. What you will probably see, that's the hypothesis, is there have been shifts happening away from all the focus on risk and environment and, you know, all kinds of internal problems to a re-establishing of security analysts that have always been there, who did the geopolitical, geostrategic thing. I assume there have been shifts going on around the event. In this case, in Europe, there's a situation where I'm in Finland, but also in NATO and so on. But there are others there well. So in terms of thing, I think when you do that form of analysis, you can speak security with the security professionals. So there is a legitimacy of the speaking through the professional, not the person outside, right? And not, oh, there is a process going on and it's contingent. No, you work with the professionals. And then you get a pluralization to some extent of the voices, but it's more in IPS. If you do the elements of sociology of fields, it is not just this field, if we are all security professionals, right? And we have different positions. It's not like I sit here and you sit there and we have different opinions. That's not how it is. It's structured. There are certain positions possible and there are certain capitals. I might have lost my influence because I am more interested in environmental things or migration and so on. And you know, this war, it is one element we need to deal with, but it's not, should not dominate ourselves. But I might have lost some of my influence. Maybe, you know, I don't know, maybe I'm old and the young generation comes in or something and things are moving. So it is not an unstructured, it's not plurality. It's not bring in more voices. The voices are already there in a structured way and there's a power struggle going on between them potentially, or at least the positioning. But so when I do that analysis, right, or you could do that, I actually can say, hey guys, you say we should join NATO all the time, but not all of you are in agreement. Maybe we should think so, but not necessarily in agreement that that is the way we should understand security. Therefore, maybe you try to put onto me a geostrategic, geopolitical pull into as if I have no option, and you try to establish doxing, but you yourself don't even agree within it because there are different positions happening. And then the toxic, the analysis is critical for me, It might be awkward because you're actually studying, talking to, letting speak security professionals, not the ones who have an alternative position from outside on security. You work with them in a structured way, but the doxic is no longer doxic. It becomes a competition or a rivalry, a structured one between them. And so I can speak at that point. If that is the situation, not all situations are similar, but this was a situation where you pulled in the professional security thing, which becomes geostrategic, geopolitical, which is very conservative, right? You pulled in. You can speak through them a security language, and it's not the only one available, to say, no, there are alternative ways of possible, or there are elements in your own environment. Yeah, there is no consensus around it. And that, of course, is a different way of positioning yourself in a securitized environment where there are no alternatives. And for me, it's a form of doing critique. In some way, I'm not talking much about transversality, but we can do that. But that has been, we can come back to that. A form of doing critique through an instrument, a sociological instrument, because the field analysis is, as I said, not just opinions. It's about also how the relations are structured and invested in it. We can, I don't have to do Bourdieu for you, but I hope you understand that our relations are not just opinions. We have certain capitals and certain positions, and we vie for influence or whatever between one another. And we have certain dispositions, because I might have been trained in a very different understanding. Maybe I'm the human rights caucus within it, right? And I've been trained in that and invested in it, and I've got my position from there. We both got our position from there, and so you guys are not. So we try to work with you. So there is a structured element, and it comes with costs and so on. So it's not just opinion within it. And I think that is very interesting, because that's a international political sociology element. I don't know whether it would work, but for me, that was the answer, one of the answers. I had another reflection as well of how critical security studies, but I said it's actually critical security studies needs to move from its critical security studies into IPS partly because it needs to do the sociology of the stuff that's going on from within. And that's how it offers. It's not the offer, but it offers an instrument to start engaging from within the legitimacy of speaking through the security professionals, which was one of the problems of how the whole thing was constructed, that if you're a social movement comes from the outside, I'm not saying they're not important, but it was so easy to tell you're naive, right? But the naivety is also already inside the security professionals, potentially. We don't know, but that's why you need to study it in that way. And so that you should not, if you do critical analysis, that's one of the arguments that comes up, you should not just go and look for the outside as the critique, but you look also for those you might not like in a way, right? Because they are the security people inside. And so you go and talk to them and learn through them of how security is defined. But the stake remains critique. It remains, let not unify, a doxification, if you want to. That is exactly what the problem was, why Finland moved so quickly from, you know, being neutral, have a lot of debate about this status. This was amazing. This has been, you know, they have a neutral status for decades. And within basically a year, that was actually a month, basically, it shifted, right? So something happened within it. And it became impossible to start taking position. Not impossible, but very difficult to start taking positions. And it has all kinds of consequences. It meant that universities are re-employing geopolitical academics, for example. So you see things happening at very different places. So I thought that's a way in which you could do critique in conservative times, because the conservatives are defined to the geopolitical, and what critique means and how IPS does this critique. I don't talk much about transfer. There's some transversal thing here as well, but I think I've run out of time to do that. But we had a lot on transversality anyway already. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, let me see if I can keep up with all that has been said. Thanks, guys, for all these very interesting interventions. My intervention is more orientated to, if you want, how can we think really in conservative times without falling into the usual traps that make us criticize conservatives through conservative politics. That's my provocation. So that's the trap that usually happens with progressive or leftist politics. It reproduces the conservatism it wants to criticize. So that's what transversality tries to avoid, to resist the temptations of, or at least the present, if you like, of common sense and of reproducing formations of power that we're fighting against. I think that's a good definition of transversality, I think. All right, we're fighting against these centralized formations of power, but we end up always reproducing, or invariantly reproducing them, and that has very pernicious effects and consequences. And when I think about conservative times, it's not that these times are exceptional. Many of these times like this have been present in the past. But it's a time when there's no clarity really about how to position ourselves and how to think politically. There's this indifferentiation, I think, between political positions. We don't know really how to orient our politics. What does transformation mean? As Kyle says, it can mean regression and it can mean moving forward. So in this sense, I think we live in a time where projects that think about time in progressive ways are gone, no doubt, right? The notion of history, doesn't mean much, but also the thought that we can organize politics through big institutions, big social formations, anyway, through states or through geopolitics or some world order. That's, only present in the more conservative way of thinking. So to seek ordering internationally or in the world, which was something that reformists always wanted, right? And the left and, the third world or whatever, that option is not open to us. And yet, a lot of what progressive politics does today involves reordering the world somehow, even if it takes defending conservative positions. And that ambivalence and that paradox is really problematic. And that's the problem of critique. Our critique doesn't do anything politically, doesn't allow us to think beyond, the binaries, the common sense, the pettiness, the microfascisms, the sectarianism, and the violence, the general violence. So it's very hard to think that way. I'm thinking about international politics, right, and world politics. So in that sense, transversality is not, a solution to everything. But in general terms, I can, and people before me have said it in a better way, just involves a politics of openness, right? It's really to resist closure. And there's a lot of closure going on. That's what I mean. Conservative times, it's a bad definition, but it's just that the trends we see in many ways, in many places where, events are unfolding, are trends that reinforce centralization and closure. A defense of more centralized organization of politics in order to orient politics toward some direction. Where do we go, right? But before we know, Ritu was referring to this, before we know where do we go, there's a question of what's going on, right? And it's difficult to answer that question today because we don't have recourse to history, we don't have recourse to the international as we usually had, and we don't have recourse to philosophies either. So in that sense, IPS, I think Kyle said it was always critical of this kind of closure. for looking for principles inside, if you like, the subject or the state, and always try to look outside in order to resist the present. So it's really oriented towards outside. So it's really anti-disciplinary in that sense. I really liked what Ritu recommended, that we don't reproduce ourselves as a field, and really that always try to resist that and try to create a jargon that only we understand. So I always fear that transversality may sound like, a very, complex concept that only we understand or we barely understand. It's not that. It's really just a mode of connection, really. It's how we put things together, decompartmentalizing, if you like. Our way of thinking, but also our research. So we don't disciplinary it, right? We don't centralize it, but we try to move across different sites, if you like, of action, but also of thinking. So that's what Guattari did, right, in Laborde and in his psychiatric practice. And that's what a lot of social movements do these days, today. Building decentralized, horizontal ways of collaborating across many different sites, ways of making worlds, of producing, of thinking. There's a lot of creativity going on, right? And that we don't usually see, but I think transversal research might be interesting to bring that into light. What's going on and that we don't see because we are, into the geopolitical mode of thinking again, right? That homogenizes everything. Of course, there is a problem of how do we resist and what are the powers we have to think creatively, right? And that's certainly not easy. But I do think that forces today are accelerating closure and centralization, and that's a problem. And IR, in that sense, as Jef was saying, right, or at least referring to, is back on track. Now we can talk about war, we can talk about security, we can talk about states, we can talk about foreign policy in our familiar ways. We don't have to worry anymore about post-positivism, about state. No, it's fine, because war helps. Yeah, that's what we have to do. We're back on track. And IR is, well, Siba Gruvugi has very well stated, right? Has its conservative roots in the celebration of power in the state, in German geopolitics, right? So the return of this geopolitical conservatism in the current context does present, I think, intellectual challenges that are singular, I think, right? Because it's not that critique is losing steam, right? But we have, as Rita said, we have to continuously reinstate this effort to criticize relentlessly and ruthlessly too. And that's not very popular because we're necessarily going to criticize and be ruthless towards our own positions, which we think are enlightened or progressive. Right? But we have to learn how to do that without, I think, without adopting the usual microfascisms we do, which is sectarianism, right? Infighting, right? The inability to connect, right? And to be solidary with the other, even if they think differently. I think Jef was referring to that. So the left is, I mean, progressive forces are very good in demonizing other, not just the right, but other forces on the left or progressive forces. So there's a lot of that going on, I think, and transversalities may seem, I think, to be out of sync with this state of affairs where what counts is organized violence, hard lines, military force, state power, no doubt, and a desire for death. I think in the desire for death, I think prevails in lots of places, right? Unfortunately. And that, once again, right, presents the risk of macro-fascisms, right? Because micro-fascisms are always there, right? There's always fascists in all of us. But the glorification of violence, I think it's complicated because it does lead, I think, potentially, right, to the colonization of the state by fascist forces. So, and I think that a lot of that is going on in the world. So thinking transversely might seem, you know, a bit idealistic, but at least it has the potential to help us resist fascisms. So, and in that sense, it affirms this way of connecting partial fragments, right, and resisting this ambition to be whole again through more total formations. So resisting the present also means not falling into the temptation of nihilism or melancholia, right? Often happens to us, right? To see the end of times, to see that, well, politics has no potency anymore. There's not much we can do. Maybe go to some community in the countryside, like Kyle was saying, right? And in the worst cases, yeah, you know, death, right? The shooting squad. So, and that also, you know, it sometimes invites some kind of cynicism. But between cynicism and stupidity, I prefer stupidity, sorry. Because stupidity is you acknowledge that you don't know what's going on, right? And that you have to think. So I prefer feeling stupid than being cynic. And I do feel stupid most of the time, right? Because I really don't know, don't understand what's going on, right? But at least it doesn't give me the certainty to act based on some notion that, well, all there is now is endism, violence, right? So anything goes. Yeah, I have to resist that. So, and here is the last provocation, right? We know that, you know, global fascism, all this conservative stuff, you know, has a lot to do with how neoliberalism creates, they say, black holes of impotence, they say, right? I don't know who said that. I have it written out. Yeah. And these black holes are filled with these micro-fascist forms of sedimentation. And that happens a lot in, you know, the authoritarian tendencies we see in many places, right? Either in Western democracies, the global South, the former Eastern socialist states. So there's all these authoritarianisms going on, and that combine with this colonization of social forms or society by neoliberalism, if you like. The problem is that these authoritarianism, and here is the problem with geopolitical imagination, right? Geopolitics allow these, you know, the Orbans of the life, the Putins, you know, the Modis, and all of the, and well, sometimes even the Bolsonaros, to reposition themselves as internationally reformists. Right? That's the trick of geopolitics, right? You have authoritarian states that internationally are anti-Western, they are anti-establishment, right? They are revisionists. So, fine, reformists. Doesn't matter if the policies they have inside, right? Outside, because we have this geopolitical imagination, they are, well, you know, maybe revolutionary. So, to resist this temptation, right, to think in terms of order and geopolitics, I think we still have, thinking transversally means that we still have to invest, I think, and this is maybe old-fashioned, right, in some form of radical democracy. The democracy is still, I think, the way to go to affirm some kind of multiplicity. And that doesn't mean reinforce, statist forms of authority. So, and here I see, again, trying to think about examples of transversality, I think the city, the urban, as a space where all these lines cross, right? Where a lot of things happen, where it's difficult to sediment, right? To stratify, to separate. I mean, there's a lot of that going on too, but it's the messy, pluralist, democratic, multiple environment, or ecology, if you like, where new things arise. I mean, and not in some community in, I don't know, the countryside where we can live happy and in closeness to nature, right? No, it's in the urban mess. It's in the city with there's crime, there's violence, but there's a lot of interesting things going on. So that's my take on transversality. It's to invest in undoing, deterritorializing the spaces that are all the time attempting to make us think as like the state and to use violence through the state. Sorry, I sounded anarchist now, right? Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Caio, Ritu, and Jef and João for the provocations, for the reactions to the prompt. So we have 20 minutes. We're gonna open to your questions now, your interventions, comments. Perhaps you should gather like a few questions and do the first round.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here for the very interesting panel. My name is Ritu, and I was a student here a couple of years ago. It has been a while, I think, for all of us, and especially the I would like to say something here in relation to what you have raised. Community. I would actually like to talk a little bit more about film sectors. I think some of the points that have already been raised by Jef and by João. When I did my MA here at PUC-Rio, I was actually studying philosophy. I was working with engineering, and I learned the notion in the first kind of critique that knowledge actually plays the project. However, that practical reason comes first, meaning that in order to assign knowledge, the society somehow needs to be able to organize for living without, killing itself. So I think his point was that, war, genocide, and a good condition for academics to work. And in some way, I think is that, state needs to provide conditions of stability for scientists, for academics, for knowledge. I think Hannah Arendt, she had an issue with this position. I think she said something like, the philosopher is always opposed to the republic. There are no dangerous thoughts. The act of thinking itself is dangerous, meaning that academics, thinkers, researchers, journalists, they're always anti-establishment. And they always very dangerous. So, these thoughts, they obviously they come, I'm originally from Germany. I've never actually, owned this a lot. I lived a long time in Brazil. However, obviously the last year, especially the last month, somehow forced me to, think a little bit more about my home country, where, as in the United States, you federal police, researchers, critical researchers, banned from territory. Yeah, there have been full federal parties to money for professors to by domestic intelligence. It's afraid that was cancelled by the and so on. So then we're talking about the limits of critique. And again, you might have this sort of like painted model that the state somehow gives projects that just that, like you're in like a situation with NATO and stuff, and then also in Germany and all that. People work with feminism and stuff, maybe do a little more like WPS. Or maybe you don't want to really write about this country, but if you could be a project to write about trade, it would be fine. Something like this, right? So many of the established limits of our critique, and I remember when I was a student here, we had I think an entire course about the 5 lives. And there was somehow novel, and today it would be possible within the current regime that is in Europe, or in Europe. So, it comes back to our responsibility as academics, should we accept these limits, or are we actually, in this position of minority or the global, like to say, we have to fight, we have to set our own limits, we shouldn't accept it, because we're the biggest, we give the limit, that they have to deal with it. This is a very difficult one, I think, I think it's not so much about always external factors, it's a little bit more about us. From organizing, living together, avoiding inequalities, avoiding united sessions, but also somehow like stopping to expect some sort of solution for this kind of knowledge, kind of academic freedom from outside.
One more to jump in.
Thank you all for your attention. I don't have like this part for you. It's maybe but it's mainly in between 12 last pieces of presentation when you talk about those black holes and golden that literally creates the space they open for passion. And that maybe a way out of it would be to invest in some form of radical democracy. And maybe and then you went on to talk about the state. And maybe I want to tie into the comment, that question about knowledge production as a collective act, and how maybe this way out into radical democracy, into maybe staying with the contradictions and with the violence and with everything that the city has offered as a solution, as paths forward instead of like isolating ourselves. And I just wanted to hear about that. Thank you for engaging with that.
So maybe one more question, and then they're gonna take their time to react, because we have another 11 minutes for. Any last question? Comments? Okay, so I'm gonna invite them maybe to respond to 2 to 3 minutes, if that's possible.
Sure. Want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay, Christina, I'm gonna pick up the issues of academic freedom and I'll do a full reveal. I'm the equivalent of a dean at Newcastle, right? So I'm kind of one of those people who oftentimes it's a role that will infringe upon academic freedom because they're the ones doing the initial knock at the door about, you know, are you really doing a teach out about Gaza right now? You have to do those kinds of things. So what can we do? So when I think about academic freedom, I think about a few things. So I think about the freedom of being able to teach and research in ways where you're not under the threat of violence, and whether that's direct violence or kind of slower forms of violence that can take place. I think about having the freedom to criticize your institution. My colleagues do it a lot. And I think about having that freedom to explore. And I think that kind of pushes beyond the legalistic definitions that are in place. And there's also that element of kind of free speech. But I think there's something really kind of tricky about this. And I'm not saying you've implied this in what you've said, but I do see it in some of my colleagues. Free speech and academic freedom isn't the same as consequence-free actions. And trying to think that through. And also thinking through that if I'm applying and willing to defend the academic freedom of colleagues, and this goes to kind of João, getting beyond the microfascisms with those who I have an affinity with, I'm also going to have to do it in some cases where I might find what the person is advocating as being deeply, deeply offensive and problematic. So it's working through all of these things. So what responsibility do we have? Creating space and safe space, having a particular kind of patience with one another when there is the disagreement. That the disagreement isn't necessarily existential. It doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad person. Sometimes it does, though. Right? It also means, I think, for those of us who are in privileged positions where we do, for the most part, have these things, it is creating the space for those who don't to come in. And whether that's as a temporary measure or as a permanent thing. And so I think one of the things that I'm very proud of that we've done in my school is we are involved with the Scholars at Risk program, and we do host people from around the world who simply cannot no longer live because of the kind of work that they're doing. So I think there are various things that we can do. I think the broader philosophical question, you do need stability, I think, to do really good academic work. It's hard to do great academic work if you're worried about what the knock on the door is going to bring. That would be my own view.
Okay, maybe I wasn't going to talk about free speech, but and I'm not going to talk about free speech, but I was thinking about how to approach the question if it's one, if the I don't use microfascism, but if the microfascisms are about how you actually are also positioned, what does it mean to be positioned on the side of free speech in current context? What kind of speech are you supposed to defend at that point? And I think this is an element of classical critique that's structured up in elements about negativity. So certain positions become almost like you have to take these, or you're on the other side, or you're there. So, for example, at some point, I'm not going to refer to the conflict, but you probably know which one it is. There was an element, we all need to talk in our courses about this conflict. Now I'm sitting there and go like, no, I don't want to talk about this. A, I don't know much about it. And B, it's not relevant for my module. It might be relevant, but I can avoid this conflict, not another conflict. So there is a pressure to come to that. And that has not, there I think that if transversality means that you do not act, because otherwise it's like, or in free speech, is the end of free speech. But what if you take a transversal approach, which really is about, you know, the multiplicity of things that are happening, which, as I said before, is not a plurality. It's not that it's just different things. They have a relationship between one another. Lots of things happens in universities, for example, where people do other things. They might not be outspoken, not be on the barricades, but do things. They work with the cracks that are possible in it. And therefore, you have this life in the making, which is more horizontal. There are bits and pieces happening all the time. That's that. So you do avoid this dichotomous or sometimes triangular kind of positioning that's required. So this is not an argument on politics, it's an argument about analysis, because you asked us to look at the insight of what we do. Well, then do look at what is happening, but use a transversal approach of the fractured kind of elements, not the already bounded positions that are possible, but what are people doing? And some people indeed are on the barricades, and others are actually doing other things. And they might not be natural allies in the sense that they're one social movement, as I said, but they are in relation, connecting, trying to shape this institution and using the cracks for whatever purpose they have. And in that sense, you know, I do think this is not necessarily critique. This is a certain form, it is a certain form of critique, but it's transversal kind of relating in a multiple way that's happening. And that I think is a more interesting, and that's how transversality works as well, because it works with, it always assumes that things are not solidified into one, right? But it is not just plurality either. There are imminently processes, relations going on, which are on the move continuously to an internal immanent dynamic. And so de facto, that means in my university, I would look at several practices that are going on, including the ones that actually try to redefine what free speech means in a way that personally I might not like, for example. So that's what I think transversality as a mode of thinking can actually come to bear in a very practical way on the debates I assume you're referring to.
I'm not a dean.
Well, no, me neither.
But a couple of things I want to say. So the first point I want to say, I know you didn't raise it in reference to what I said about immanent critique. So if your object of immanent critique is just argument or theoretical framework, I take your point, right? But immanent critique is actually political critique, if you take it in Marxist sense. So immanent critique is social critique. It's asking, do the practices, the relations that exist in our society actually measure up to the norms that are claimed, right? And then you recognize, no, they don't. Why don't they? It's because of social relations of domination. So I think immanent critique is something that we actually need to do more work in terms of showing not just, you know, academic work, but as social and political critique. The other thing I want to say is something we've been talking a lot about in the class that I ran, which is paranoid critique. Most academics, especially academics who are doing critical theory, like all of us here, we're engaged in our default position is paranoid critique, right? So we end up producing what Sherry Ortner in anthropology calls a dark anthropology, that you're only looking at the downside of things, right? War, genocide, all of that. And here I want to say that fractures does a lot more work for me than transversality. And not to put a nice gloss on the face of, you know, UK academia, but despite everything that's wrong with the world, especially what was going on with the Middle East and what was going on with Gaza in the United States, in the last year, I've been in Aberdeen now for more than a decade. We've had two fantastic successes, which is we've warded off mass redundancies in the language of the Department of Modern Languages, because people came together, right? And there has been tremendous work done on, well, we can say this is liberal thing, basic polity, but whatever little pressure that we could place on senior management, the faculty have really run with it. So at a time where the pressure, the conservative pressure was a lot, University of Aberdeen faculty in the last 1 year have had maximum successes, right? So one has to make the most of whatever cracks appear, and one has to run with, right? And there are always people what one can work with, right? So I take Jeff's argument about the division, and there isn't complete consensus within every institution, but there is a dynamic of power. So it isn't just multiplicity, but when you're looking for cracks, you can find people in positions of power that you can work with. And I think too often, because we are more comfortable thinking in a paranoid mode, so I'm not advocating reparative, by the way. But there are spaces for doing political work in solidarity with others. And I think we have to hang on to that. Otherwise, kind of life is impossible. So even in the darkest time, you can do something. You don't have to go to the countryside. You can come to Rio instead.
Yeah, I don't have an alternative, Marina, to all this that's going on, but I do try to look at the city, or at least what's going on in the city, and a lot of that's been going on in the past decade or a decade and a half in terms of insurrections, revolt, resistance, contestation, has happened in cities, right? The problem is that a lot has been codified sometimes, right? Either as inconsequential, right? Not sufficiently political, or potentially co-opted by the right, like the 2013 movements here in Brazil. So it is as if the city has no potency really to change anything because of the logics, of, I don't know, planetary urbanism, right, if you like, of capitalism that sees the city as the privileged site for accumulation in this next cycle and production of value, right? And all kinds of things that we know that happen in the city. However, we tend to look at it that way and not see things that maybe didn't pan out, right? Didn't work out as we thought, or things that didn't scale up, right? Or if they did scale up, they failed, like the Arab Spring in that case, right? So in that sense, we devalue, right, the minute changes, if you like, that happen not at the level of these big formations, right, but happen, in places we don't really see, or in sites we don't see, or at least, with people we don't live with. So in that sense, there is a tendency, in environmentalism, if you like, or in some more radical left politics, to be skeptical, right, of the possibilities of resistance, if you like, or contestation, to transform society or transform the way of life, if you like, or social formation into something else that is not what we're used to, which is, some kind of, state that can contest imperialism, colonialism, and so forth globally, right? So that's what we have now in Brazil. Our great revolutionary thing now is multipolarity, right? Yay. And the BRICS, right? So it's, it's a bit disheartening. So I'm skeptical, I think, more and more skeptical that, taking over the state will do anything, really. I've always was, actually. But since it's coming back, right, let's take over the state. Otherwise, the right will do that. I'm more and more skeptical. And I try to think that instead of saying that we cannot do change in the actual conditions of in which we live in, the urban, if you like, the city, and the spaces in which we live, and perhaps we have to de-link, or we have to detach ourselves and seek autonomy somewhere else, like the Zapatistas, or, more autonomous communities. There are a lot of that going on. And I don't criticize it. That's because there is a sense that there's nothing really we can do to avoid the end of the world. So let's go somewhere where we can survive. And that's present in all the imaginaries, right? About post-apocalyptic fiction and the possibilities of humanity to reinvent itself. So humanity seems to be doomed in that sense. But I prefer not humanity. I'm not particularly fond of humanity, but I'm part of it. So I prefer to living, you know, as a human in places that the humans build, to live next to each other. And the city, I think, is the most interesting place to do that, even if complicated. So doesn't sound very hopeful, but at least it's not cynical, right? Thanks.
Well, it's past 6 now, so I hope we can keep this conversation going. If you're not part of the IPS Brazil network, just you're all invited to it. Just contact us. And next week we have, before I say goodbye, we have another roundtable. It's on critical thinking in IR in Brazil today. So we're gonna have Victor Lage, Paulo Chamon, Ana Carolina Delgado, Beto Yamato moderating. So you're all welcome and invited to come and to talk some more about critical, what does it mean to do critical thinking. So thank you all for coming.